Colonel Sarah Chen stood at the podium in Camp Lejeune's main briefing hall, watching 200 Marines shift restlessly in their seats as she prepared to deliver what they clearly considered a routine guest lecture on combat logistics. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that in less than 6 hours these same Marines would be taking orders from her as hostile forces breached the base perimeter and their entire command structure collapsed around them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning had started typically enough for Sarah. She'd arrived at the North Carolina base at 0530, her rental car's GPS guiding her through the pre-dawn darkness to the visitor's gate. The young corporal checking her credentials had been polite, but disinterested, processing her temporary access badge with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd seen countless civilian contractors and guest speakers pass through these gates. To him, she was just another former military officer making the rounds on the lecture circuit, probably here to talk about her war stories and collect a speaking fee. Sarah understood the perception. At 42, she stood 5'6", with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a conservative navy blazer over dress pants. Nothing about her appearance suggested the 20-year Army career that had taken her through 3 combat deployments, or the Bronze Star citation that recognized her actions during a particularly brutal engagement in Afghanistan. The Marines saw a middle-aged woman with a soft voice and a PowerPoint presentation, not the former infantry officer who had once coordinated the defense of Forward Operating Base Thunder during a sustained enemy assault that lasted 14 hours. The base itself buzzed with its usual morning energy as Sarah made her way to the briefing hall. Marines jogged in formation along the main thoroughfare, their cadence calls echoing off the concrete buildings. Supply trucks rumbled past carrying equipment to various training areas. Helicopters practiced landing patterns at the airfield, their rotors creating a constant background rhythm that Sarah found oddly comforting. It reminded her of mornings in Kandahar, when the anticipation of another day's missions hung in the air like humidity. She'd been invited to speak by Major Rebecca Torres, an old friend from her days at the Command and General Staff College. Torres had called 3 months earlier, explaining that the base was hosting a series of lectures on inter-service cooperation and lessons learned from recent conflicts. Sarah's experience coordinating joint operations between Army and Marine units made her a natural choice for the program. What Torres hadn't mentioned, what she couldn't have known, was that Sarah had spent the past 2 years since leaving the service studying asymmetric warfare tactics, analyzing how small hostile forces could exploit vulnerabilities in large military installations. The briefing hall itself was a testament to military functionality over aesthetics. Rows of metal folding chairs faced a raised platform equipped with a podium and projection screen. Fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh white illumination, while the walls displayed the usual collection of unit insignia, motivational posters, and safety reminders that decorated every military facility Sarah had ever seen. She'd spoken in dozens of similar venues over the past 2 years, from military colleges to corporate conference rooms, sharing insights from her combat experience with audiences who politely applauded and forgot her words the moment she left the stage. As the Marines filed into the hall, Sarah observed their behavior with the analytical eye that had served her well during her military career. Most were young, probably in their early 20s, with the confident swagger that came from knowing they belonged to one of the world's most elite fighting forces. They talked among themselves about weekend plans, upcoming training exercises, and complaints about mess hall food. A few checked their phones discreetly, while others dozed in their seats despite the early hour. Their body language conveyed a clear message. This was mandatory attendance at another boring lecture they'd have to endure before getting back to their real duties. Major Torres introduced Sarah with the standard biography recitation that reduced 20 years of military service to a list of assignments and decorations. The audience's attention wandered visibly as Torres mentioned Sarah's tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, her time at the Pentagon working on doctrine development, and her current work as a defense consultant. To these Marines, her credentials were impressive on paper but irrelevant to their daily reality of training exercises and equipment maintenance. They'd heard from plenty of former officers who came to share war stories and leadership lessons that seemed disconnected from their current experience. Sarah stepped to the podium with the quiet confidence that had carried her through briefings with generals, and conversations with hostile village elders. She'd learned long ago that credibility couldn't be assumed. It had to be earned through demonstration. Her prepared remarks focused on the challenges of joint operations, the importance of inter-service communication, and the lessons learned from coordinating between different military cultures. Standard material that would satisfy the requirements of her speaking contract while keeping the audience awake. But as she began speaking, Sarah noticed something that immediately shifted her attention away from her prepared script. Through the hall's windows, she could see unusual activity on the base's perimeter road. Vehicles that didn't match the standard military pattern were moving in what appeared to be coordinated formations. Her trained eye recognized the subtle signs of reconnaissance activity, the way the vehicles maintained specific distances and timing that suggested professional military planning rather than routine civilian traffic. Sarah continued her presentation while mentally cataloging what she observed. The vehicles were civilian models, but they moved with military precision. Their occupants appeared to be conducting surveillance of the base's security checkpoints and defensive positions. Most concerning was the timing. The unusual activity was occurring during the morning briefing period, when the majority of the base's personnel were either in meetings or conducting routine training away from their primary defensive positions. The Marines in her audience remained focused on their phones and whispered conversations, oblivious to the developing situation outside. Their sergeants occasionally called for attention or quiet, but the overall atmosphere remained relaxed and informal. Sarah realized that she was probably the only person in the room who had noticed the anomalous activity, and possibly the only one present with enough experience to interpret its significance. Her presentation continued for another 20 minutes, covering the standard talking points about leadership, adaptability, and the importance of understanding different military cultures. But her mind was racing through tactical assessments and threat evaluations. The pattern of vehicle movement suggested a coordinated reconnaissance effort by a well-trained hostile force. The timing coincided with what would be optimal conditions for a surprise attack on a military installation. Most disturbing was the realization that the base's current security posture appeared completely inadequate for the threat that seemed to be developing. As Sarah concluded her prepared remarks and opened the floor for questions, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of the polite academic discussion that usually followed her presentations, she was going to share her growing concerns about what she'd observed. The Marines might dismiss her as just another guest speaker, but her conscience wouldn't allow her to remain silent about a potential threat to their safety. The first question came from a Lance Corporal in the third row, asking about the differences between Army and Marine Corps training methods. Sarah answered briefly, then redirected the conversation. She described what she'd observed through the windows, explaining the tactical significance of the vehicle movements and the potential threat they represented. The room's atmosphere shifted from casual boredom to skeptical attention as she outlined her concerns. Most of the Marines exchanged glances that clearly conveyed their doubts about taking tactical advice from a guest speaker. A few looked toward the window she'd referenced, but from their seated positions, they couldn't see the activity she described. Their expressions suggested they thought she was either mistaken about what she'd seen or overreacting to routine civilian traffic. After all, what were the chances that a random guest speaker would correctly identify a genuine security threat that the base's own personnel had missed? Sarah understood their skepticism, but she also understood the responsibility that came with her observations and experience. Whether the Marines believed her or not, she had identified what appeared to be a credible threat to their installation. Her 20 years of military service had taught her that the cost of being wrong about a potential threat was usually manageable, while the cost of being right and ignored could be catastrophic. Hong Kong. The question and answer session continued for another 15 minutes, with Sarah providing conventional responses to routine inquiries while mentally preparing for what might come next. If her tactical assessment was correct, the base would soon face a crisis that would test every lesson she'd learned during her combat deployments. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might finally have an opportunity to apply her expertise in the most meaningful way possible, just not in the manner anyone had expected when they invited her to deliver a guest lecture on inter-service cooperation. The first sign that Sarah's concerns were being dismissed came during the informal reception that followed her presentation. Major Torres had arranged for coffee and pastries in the adjacent conference room, creating an opportunity for individual Marines to ask follow-up questions or engage in casual conversation. Instead, Sarah found herself standing alone near the refreshment table, while clusters of Marines discussed weekend liberty plans and upcoming training schedules. Sergeant First Class Marcus Rodriguez approached her with the polite but distant demeanor that military personnel reserved for civilian visitors. His 23 years of service were evident in his weathered face and the confident way he carried himself, but his expression suggested he was fulfilling a social obligation rather than seeking genuine interaction. "Ma'am, thank you for the presentation," Rodriguez said, balancing a paper cup of coffee while maintaining the formal posture that never quite left career Marines. Always interesting to hear different perspectives on joint operations. Sarah recognized the diplomatic brush-off but decided to press her concerns anyway. "Sergeant Rodriguez, did you happen to notice the vehicle activity along the perimeter road during the briefing? The pattern seemed unusual for routine civilian traffic." Rodriguez glanced toward the windows, then back at Sarah with an expression that didn't quite hide his skepticism. "Ma'am, we get a lot of civilian traffic through this area. Construction crews, delivery vehicles, contractors working on various projects. Nothing that stands out as particularly unusual." "I understand, but the timing and coordination of the movements suggested something more systematic. The vehicles maintained specific intervals and appeared to be conducting reconnaissance of security checkpoints," Sarah persisted, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention from other conversations in the room. The sergeant's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, with respect, base security is handled by personnel who are specifically trained and assigned to monitor potential threats. If there was something worth investigating, they would have identified it." Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being politely dismissed, but she also recognized the institutional thinking that made Rodriguez's response predictable. Military organizations operated on clearly defined chains of responsibility, and a guest speaker raising security concerns fell well outside those established parameters. Her observations would be discounted not because they lacked merit, but because they came from someone without official authority or current military status. Lieutenant Jessica Park joined their conversation, her youth and eagerness evident in the way she sought to engage with the visiting speaker. At 25, Park represented the new generation of Marine officers, well-educated and ambitious, but lacking the combat experience that might have made her more receptive to Sarah's concerns. "Colonel Chen, I was wondering about your experience with interagency coordination in Afghanistan," Park began, clearly prepared to steer the conversation towards safer academic topics. "Did you find that cultural differences between services created significant operational challenges?" Sarah answered the question professionally while noting that Park's body language suggested she'd overheard the previous exchange about perimeter security. The lieutenant's expression conveyed the same polite skepticism that Rodriguez had displayed, along with what appeared to be mild embarrassment that a guest speaker was raising alarmist concerns about base security. The pattern continued throughout the reception as Sarah interacted with various Marines. Each conversation followed a similar trajectory: polite acknowledgement of her presentation, deflection when she raised security concerns, and gradual withdrawal as her persistence made them increasingly uncomfortable. She began to understand that her status as an outsider, combined with what they perceived as inappropriate alarm about routine activities, was undermining any credibility she might have established through her military credentials. Captain David Walsh, the base's assistant operations officer, approached Sarah near the end of the reception with the air of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty. His manner was more direct than the others, suggesting he'd been delegated to address her concerns definitively. "Colonel Chen, I understand you've expressed some concerns about activities you observed during your presentation," Walsh began, his tone carrying the authority of someone speaking for the command structure. "I want to assure you that base security is continuously monitored by qualified personnel using appropriate protocols and technology." Sarah recognized this as the official response designed to close down further discussion. "Captain, I appreciate that, but my observations suggested coordinated reconnaissance activity that might warrant additional scrutiny. The timing and patterns were consistent with pre-assault intelligence gathering." Walsh's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am, I think you may be reading too much into routine civilian activities. This base processes hundreds of civilian vehicles daily through legitimate business with various contractors and service providers. What you observed was most likely related to ongoing construction projects or maintenance activities." "I understand that possibility," Sarah replied, "but my combat experience has taught me to recognize the difference between routine activity and potential threats." The vehicle movements I observed exhibited tactical discipline that suggested military training. The captain's patience was clearly exhausted. "Colonel, with all due respect, you're no longer in an active military role, and you're not familiar with this base's normal operational patterns. Our security personnel are fully qualified to assess and respond to any legitimate threats. I think it would be appropriate to trust their professional judgment." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Sarah was being told, in diplomatic military language, to stay in her lane and avoid raising concerns that fell outside her role as a guest speaker. The conversation effectively ended when Walsh excused himself to attend to other duties, leaving Sarah to understand that her warnings had been officially noted and officially disregarded. As the reception wound down, Sarah overheard fragments of conversations that confirmed her growing isolation. Near the coffee station, two corporals were discussing her presentation with the casual irreverence that enlisted personnel reserved for officers they considered out of touch. "Did you hear her going on about suspicious vehicles?" the first corporal muttered to his companion. "Lady's been watching too many action movies. Probably sees terrorists behind every delivery truck." His companion nodded agreement. "Yeah, these retired officers sometimes have trouble adjusting to civilian life. Start seeing threats everywhere. My dad's buddy from Vietnam does the same thing, always talking about security risks and surveillance." The words stung more than Sarah expected, not because they were particularly harsh, but because they revealed how completely her concerns had been mischaracterized. Her legitimate tactical observations were being dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of someone who couldn't adjust to post-military life. The implication that she was psychologically unstable, rather than professionally vigilant, effectively neutralized any credibility she might have retained. Major Torres approached as Sarah prepared to leave, her expression conveying both gratitude for the presentation and mild concern about the reception's aftermath. "Sarah, thank you again for coming. I hope the questions weren't too challenging. Sometimes the Marines can be a bit direct in their approach." "The questions were fine, Rebecca," Sarah replied, recognizing that Torres was diplomatically addressing the awkwardness that had developed around her security concerns. "I appreciate the opportunity to share experiences with your personnel." Torres hesitated, clearly wanting to address the elephant in the room. "I heard there was some discussion about base security matters. I hope you understand that the Marines take those responsibilities very seriously and have established procedures for handling any legitimate concerns." The message was clear. Sarah's warnings had been heard, evaluated, and dismissed through proper channels. Any further pursuit of the matter would be considered inappropriate interference in military operations by someone without authority or current qualification to make such assessments. Sarah left the base that morning with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with hurt feelings or wounded pride. Her tactical instincts, honed through years of combat experience, continued to signal that something was wrong. The vehicle movements she'd observed fit a pattern that was deeply familiar from her deployments in hostile environments. The timing coincided with operational conditions that would favor a surprise attack on a military installation. Most concerning was the realization that her warnings had been not just dismissed, but effectively marginalized through subtle implications about her psychological state and professional relevance. The Marines' response followed a predictable pattern of institutional thinking that prioritized established procedures over external warnings, regardless of their potential validity. As Sarah drove away from Camp Lejeune, she understood that she was probably the only person who recognized the developing threat. Her combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts, even when others disagreed. But it had also taught her that being right about threats that others missed could be a lonely and dangerous position. The question now was whether her concerns were justified, and if so, what she could do about a situation where her warnings had already been dismissed as the misguided fears of an outsider who no longer understood how real military operations worked. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same institutional thinking that had dismissed her concerns might soon be desperately in need of the experience and perspective they'd just rejected. Sarah Chen had always been someone who prepared for possibilities that others considered unlikely. During her 20 years of active duty, this tendency had earned her a reputation as thorough but sometimes obsessive, the kind of officer who maintained detailed contingency plans for scenarios that her colleagues deemed improbable. Now, 2 years into civilian life, That same compulsion drove her to spend her evenings researching subjects that had no direct relevance to her consulting work, but satisfied an intellectual curiosity that retirement had failed to diminish. Her home office in Arlington, Virginia, reflected this systematic approach to understanding complex subjects. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves contained volumes on military history, strategic theory, and contemporary security challenges. A large monitor dominated her desk, surrounded by notebooks filled with her careful handwriting and printed articles marked with highlighter and marginal notes. To a casual observer, it might have appeared to be the workspace of an academic researcher rather than a former infantry officer turned defense consultant. For the past 18 months, Sarah had been conducting an unofficial study of security vulnerabilities at military installations. The project had begun innocuously enough, sparked by a conversation with a fellow veteran who mentioned concerning gaps in perimeter security at his former base. Sarah's analytical mind had seized on the topic, leading her down a research path that consumed most of her free time and produced insights that she shared with no one. She had systematically analyzed publicly available information about dozens of military facilities, studying satellite imagery, traffic patterns, and security protocols that were documented in official publications or discussed in professional journals. Her methodology was rigorous, approaching each installation as if she were planning either its defense or its assault. The exercise was purely intellectual, a way to apply her military training to hypothetical scenarios that engaged her strategic thinking. What she discovered was troubling. Modern military bases, designed during an era when the primary threats came from conventional military forces, showed consistent vulnerabilities to asymmetric attacks by small, well-trained hostile groups. Perimeter security often relied on technology and procedures that could be compromised by adversaries with sufficient preparation and tactical knowledge. Most concerning was the tendency for base security to focus on preventing unauthorized access rather than defending against coordinated assaults by forces that had already penetrated the initial barriers. Sarah's analysis had identified Camp Lejeune as particularly vulnerable due to its size, location, and the predictable patterns of its daily operations. The base's proximity to civilian areas provided numerous observation points for reconnaissance. Its regular schedule of training exercises and administrative activities created windows of opportunity when security attention was focused elsewhere. Most importantly, the base's confidence in its own defensive capabilities might create complacency that could be exploited by a sufficiently sophisticated adversary. Her research had also led her to study the tactics employed by hostile forces in recent attacks on military installations worldwide. She analyzed the 2009 assault on Fort Hood, the 2013 attack on the Westgate shopping mall in Kenya, and numerous smaller incidents that demonstrated how determined adversaries could overcome seemingly robust security measures. The common thread was meticulous preparation, exploitation of predictable routines, and the ability to achieve tactical surprise against forces that were theoretically superior in training and equipment. This background knowledge explained why the vehicle movements she'd observed at Camp Lejeune had triggered such immediate alarm. The patterns matched reconnaissance techniques that she'd studied in declassified after-action reports from successful attacks on military facilities. The timing coincided with conditions that her analysis had identified as optimal for launching an assault on that particular base. Most importantly, the sophisticated coordination suggested adversaries with professional military training rather than opportunistic criminals or amateur terrorists. Sarah had spent the evening after her guest lecture reviewing satellite imagery of Camp Lejeune, comparing current conditions with historical patterns she documented during her research. The exercise confirmed her growing concerns while revealing additional vulnerabilities that she hadn't previously identified. The base's current security posture appeared to be optimized for routine operations rather than defense against a coordinated assault. Her analysis identified several critical weaknesses that a hostile force might exploit. The main gate and primary checkpoints were designed to process routine traffic efficiently, but they created bottlenecks that could be overwhelmed by a coordinated attack. The base's communication systems relied on infrastructure that could be disrupted by adversaries with knowledge of its configuration. Most concerning was the predictable deployment of security personnel, who followed patterns that could be observed and exploited by patient adversaries. Sarah's research had also revealed the psychological factors that made military installations vulnerable to surprise attacks. Personnel trained for conventional warfare often struggled to recognize threats that didn't fit established patterns. Chain-of-command structures that worked effectively in normal operations could become liabilities during rapidly developing crises. Most importantly, the institutional confidence that came from superior training and equipment could create blind spots that adversaries learned to exploit. As she reviewed her notes and analysis, Sarah understood that her warnings at Camp Lejeune had been dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they challenged assumptions that the Marines weren't prepared to question. Her observations suggested vulnerabilities that their training and experience hadn't prepared them to recognize. Her status as an outsider, rather than lending credibility to her concerns, had made them easier to dismiss as the unfounded fears of someone who didn't understand current military realities. The frustration of being dismissed was compounded by Sarah's growing certainty that her tactical assessment had been correct. Every instinct developed through years of combat experience told her that Camp Lejeune was facing an imminent threat that its personnel hadn't recognized. Her research provided the context that made the threat's sophistication apparent, while her military training gave her the expertise to recognize patterns that others had missed. Sarah had always believed that preparation was the most reliable defense against uncertainty. Her evening routine now included monitoring news reports and social media for any mentions of unusual activity near military installations. She tracked weather patterns that might affect security operations and followed intelligence summaries that were available through her security clearance. The information painted a picture of increasing global instability and growing threats to American military facilities. Her professional network included dozens of former colleagues who remained on active duty or worked in various aspects of defense and security. Through casual conversations and professional correspondence, she maintained awareness of current threats and security concerns that might not make it into public reporting. This informal intelligence network had been invaluable during her consulting work, providing insights that enhanced her ability to advise clients on security matters. Recently, several of these contacts had mentioned increased concerns about potential attacks on domestic military installations. The threats were vague and unspecific, the kind of elevated alert status that became routine background noise in the post-9/11 security environment. But Sarah's research had taught her to look for patterns in seemingly unrelated information, and the recent uptick in threat reporting coincided troublingly with her observations at Camp Lejeune. Her analysis suggested that hostile forces might be conducting coordinated reconnaissance of multiple military installations, gathering intelligence for potential simultaneous attacks that could overwhelm the military's ability to respond effectively. The sophistication of the surveillance sheet observed indicated adversaries with professional military training and significant resources. Most concerning was the possibility that her warnings at Camp Lejeune had been dismissed at other installations as well, creating a systematic vulnerability that hostile forces might be prepared to exploit. Sarah understood that her unofficial research and informal intelligence gathering placed her in a unique position to recognize patterns that others might miss. Her combination of combat experience, analytical skills, and dedicated study of asymmetric threats gave her insights that few others possessed. The question was whether anyone would listen to warnings from someone whose credibility had already been questioned, and whose authority to make such assessments had been explicitly challenged. As she prepared for bed that evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would continue monitoring the situation at Camp Lejeune and other potentially vulnerable installations, using her research and intelligence contacts to track developing threats. If her assessment proved correct, she would be prepared to act on her knowledge regardless of whether anyone else was willing to listen to her warnings. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting Sarah from the light sleep that had become her norm since leaving active duty. The number on her phone display belonged to Major Rebecca Torres at Camp Lejeune, and the timing suggested either an emergency or a serious misunderstanding about time zones. Sarah answered on the second ring, immediately alert despite the early hour. "Sarah, I'm sorry to call so late, but we need to discuss your visit yesterday," Torres began, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present during their previous conversations. "There have been some concerns raised about statements you made regarding base security." Sarah sat up in bed, instantly recognizing the formal tone that military officers used when addressing potentially sensitive issues. "What kind of concerns, Rebecca?" "The kind that require documentation and follow-up," Torres replied. "Colonel Matthews wants to speak with you about your observations and any additional information you might have regarding potential threats to this installation." Colonel James Matthews was the base commander, a career Marine with 30 years of service and a reputation for taking security matters seriously. Sarah had never met him personally, but his record included multiple combat deployments and staff assignments that suggested he wasn't prone to overreaction. If Matthews wanted to discuss her concerns, it meant that someone had decided her warnings might warrant investigation. "I can be there this afternoon," Sarah said, already calculating drive time and mentally reviewing the observations she'd documented. "Should I bring any specific materials or prepare a formal briefing?" Torres hesitated before responding. "Sarah, I need to be direct with you. There are questions about your motivations for raising these concerns and whether your observations represent legitimate security issues or misinterpretation of routine activities. Colonel Matthews wants to determine which scenario we're dealing with." The implication was clear. Sarah's warnings were being investigated not just for their validity, but for the possibility that she had misrepresented normal base operations as potential threats. Her credibility was under scrutiny in a way that could have serious consequences for her reputation and her ability to work with military organizations in the future. "I understand the Colonel's position," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm prepared to discuss my observations in detail and provide the context that led to my concerns." The conversation ended with arrangements for an afternoon meeting, but Sarah understood that much more was at stake than simply clarifying her security concerns. Her professional reputation and her relationships within the military community could be permanently damaged if her warnings were determined to be unfounded or, worse, deliberately misleading. Sarah spent the morning preparing for what would essentially be an interrogation disguised as a briefing. She reviewed her notes from the previous day, organized her thoughts about the vehicle movements she'd observed, and prepared to defend her tactical assessment against skepticism that would likely be more intense than what she'd encountered during the reception. The drive to Camp Lejeune gave her time to consider the broader implications of the situation. If her concerns were dismissed definitively, she would have no further opportunity to warn the base about what she believed to be an imminent threat. If her warnings were taken seriously but proved to be incorrect, she would face professional embarrassment and potential questions about her judgment. The only positive outcome would be validation of her concerns followed by appropriate security measures, but that seemed increasingly unlikely, given the tone of Torres's call. Sarah arrived at the base to find the atmosphere markedly different from her previous visit. The guards at the main gate checked her credentials more thoroughly, examining her identification and temporary access badge with the careful attention usually reserved for unknown visitors rather than returning guests. Their demeanor was professional but noticeably cooler, suggesting that word of her security concerns had spread beyond the immediate command structure. Major Torres met her at the Visitor Processing Center with an expression that mixed personal concern with professional duty. Their friendship, built during years of shared military service, was clearly being tested by the current situation. Torres's body language conveyed the awkwardness of someone caught between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. "Sarah, before we go to see Colonel Matthews, I need to ask you directly about yesterday's observations," Torres said as they walked toward the headquarters building. "Are you absolutely certain about what you saw, and are you prepared to defend your interpretation under scrutiny?" The question revealed the stakes involved. Torres was essentially asking whether Sarah was willing to risk her reputation on what might be a misunderstanding of routine base activities. The implication was that backing down now might preserve their friendship and Sarah's professional standing, while proceeding could damage both irreparably. "Rebecca, I saw coordinated reconnaissance activity by vehicles that exhibited tactical discipline consistent with military training," Sarah replied. "I'm prepared to defend that assessment and explain why the timing and patterns suggested preparation for a potential assault on this installation." Torres nodded grimly. "I hope you're right, Sarah, because if you're wrong, this could get very unpleasant for both of us." The meeting with Colonel Matthews took place in a conference room adjacent to his office, with the base's senior staff officers present as observers. The setting was formal and slightly intimidating, designed to emphasize the seriousness of the discussion and the authority of the participants. Sarah recognized the dynamic immediately. She was being placed in the position of justifying her concerns to people who had already decided they were probably unfounded. Colonel Matthews was a compact man in his early 50s, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his career in demanding assignments. His manner was courteous but skeptical, suggesting that he was fulfilling a duty to investigate her concerns while expecting to conclude that they were baseless. Colonel Chen, I understand you've expressed concerns about potential threats to this installation based on observations you made during your visit yesterday, Matthews began, his tone suggesting that he considered the meeting a formality rather than a genuine security consultation. Sarah provided a detailed account of her observations, describing the vehicle movements, timing, and tactical patterns that had triggered her alarm. She explained her assessment of the reconnaissance techniques and the implications for base security. Throughout her presentation, she was acutely aware of the skeptical expressions and exchanged glances among the staff officers. Major Stephen Bradley, the base operations officer, interrupted her presentation with questions that revealed his dismissive attitude toward her concerns. Colonel Chen, you mentioned that these vehicles exhibited, quote, tactical discipline. Can you be more specific about what you observed that led to that conclusion? Sarah explained the consistent spacing, coordinated timing, and systematic coverage of key security points that characterize professional military reconnaissance. Her explanation was technically accurate and based on established doctrine, but she could see that her audience remained unconvinced. Ma'am, with respect, those characteristics could also describe routine coordination between civilian contractors working on various base projects, Bradley continued. Without additional context or corroborating intelligence, it's difficult to distinguish between routine civilian activities and potential threats. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, with each staff officer probing different aspects of her observations and assessment. Sarah recognized the pattern. They were systematically challenging every element of her analysis, looking for inconsistencies or alternative explanations that would allow them to dismiss her concerns as misunderstandings rather than legitimate warnings. Colonel Matthews concluded the meeting with a summary that effectively neutralized Sarah's warnings, while maintaining the appearance of taking them seriously. Colonel Chen, we appreciate your concerns and your willingness to share your observations with us. Base security will review your information and take appropriate measures if additional investigation reveals any legitimate threats. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Sarah's concerns had been noted, evaluated, and essentially dismissed. Her warnings would be filed as part of the official record, but no significant changes to base security would result from her information. She had been heard but not believed, acknowledged but not taken seriously. As Sarah left Camp Lejeune for the second time in 2 days, she understood that she had exhausted her official channels for raising security concerns. Her warnings had been systematically discredited through a process that appeared thorough, but was actually designed to confirm predetermined conclusions. The base would continue operating under security assumptions that she believed were dangerously inadequate, while she would be remembered as the retired officer who had raised unfounded alarms about routine civilian activities. The frustration was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a growing certainty that her tactical assessment had been correct, and that Camp Lejeune remained vulnerable to the threat she had identified. The attack began at 04:47 hours on a Thursday morning when most of Camp Lejeune was still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. Sarah Chen was awake in her hotel room 12 miles from the base, unable to sleep due to the persistent anxiety that had plagued her since her dismissive meeting with Colonel Matthews 3 days earlier. She had checked out of her original accommodations but found herself unable to leave the area, driven by an instinct she couldn't fully explain to remain close to what she believed was an impending crisis. The first indication that something was wrong came through her emergency scanner app, which monitored military and law enforcement radio frequencies. At 0449, she heard the code phrase, "lightning strike," transmitted on the base security frequency, followed immediately by reports of explosions at the main gate and simultaneous breaches at 3 perimeter locations. The coordinated nature of the attack confirmed every tactical assessment she had made during her unauthorized investigation. Sarah was dressed and in her rental car within minutes, driving toward Camp Lejeune despite knowing that civilian access would be impossible during an active security incident. Her 20 years of military experience had taught her that the initial moments of any crisis were characterized by confusion and communication failures, conditions that could be exploited by prepared adversaries but also by someone with the knowledge and determination to provide assistance. The radio chatter painted a picture of devastating effectiveness by the attacking force. Hostile elements had penetrated the base perimeter at multiple points using coordinated explosions that disabled key security systems. The timing had been perfectly calculated to coincide with shift changes and routine activities that left critical positions temporarily understaffed. Most concerning were reports that the attackers demonstrated detailed knowledge of base layout, security protocols, and personnel deployment patterns. As Sarah approached the vicinity of Camp Lejeune, she could see smoke rising from several locations within the base perimeter and the distinctive glow of fires that suggested significant structural damage. Emergency vehicles from multiple jurisdictions were converging on the area, their sirens creating a cacophony that would have been audible for miles. The scale of the response indicated that this was no ordinary security incident, but a major assault on one of the Marine Corps' most important installations. Sarah parked her vehicle at a convenience store approximately 2 miles from the main gate and attempted to establish communication with base personnel through emergency frequencies. Her security clearance and military credentials provided access to communication channels that civilian first responders couldn't monitor, giving her a clearer picture of the developing crisis than most outside observers would have. The situation reports were alarming. The attacking force consisted of approximately 30 individuals organized into teams that demonstrated professional military training and sophisticated tactical coordination. They had successfully neutralized primary communication systems, disabled key defensive positions, and established control over critical infrastructure, including the base's power grid and water supply. Most disturbing was intelligence suggesting that the attackers possessed detailed information about base personnel, ongoing operations, and security procedures. Colonel Matthews' voice dominated the emergency communications, but Sarah could hear the strain and confusion that characterized his attempts to coordinate a response to an assault that had achieved nearly complete tactical surprise. The base's defensive plans had been designed to counter conventional military threats or terrorist attacks by small, poorly equipped groups. They were proving inadequate against adversaries who combined terrorist tactics with military-grade training and intelligence. At 0523 hours, Sarah heard a transmission that changed everything. Major Torres was requesting immediate assistance from any available personnel with combat experience and knowledge of asymmetric warfare tactics. The base's conventional response had failed to contain the threat, and the command structure was desperately seeking alternative approaches to a crisis that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She activated her emergency beacon and transmitted on the command frequency, identifying herself and offering her assistance based on her analysis of the attack patterns and her understanding of the tactical situation. The response was immediate and desperate. Colonel Matthews authorized her immediate access to the base despite the ongoing security incident. The drive to Camp Lejeune through roads clogged with emergency vehicles took nearly 20 minutes, during which Sarah monitored communications and developed her understanding of the tactical situation. The attacking force had executed a textbook asymmetric assault, using their detailed intelligence and professional training to overcome a much larger but conventionally organized defensive force. Their success had been facilitated by exactly the vulnerabilities that Sarah had identified during her earlier analysis. The main gate area was a scene of controlled chaos when Sarah arrived. Emergency vehicles, military personnel, and law enforcement officers were coordinating response efforts while dealing with the immediate aftermath of the explosive breach that had initiated the attack. The precision of the assault was evident in the targeted damage to specific security systems and the minimal harm to personnel who weren't directly involved in base defense. Major Torres met Sarah at the temporary command post that had been established in an armored vehicle parked behind the damaged gate complex. Torres's expression mixed relief at seeing additional expertise with concern about the unprecedented nature of the crisis they were facing. "Sarah, thank God you're here," Torres said, her professional composure barely containing the stress of the situation. "We're dealing with something that none of our training prepared us for. These attackers know our base better than some of our own personnel." Sarah quickly reviewed the tactical displays and situation reports that outlined the current status of the assault. The attacking force had achieved their initial objectives with devastating efficiency, but they appeared to be transitioning to a sustained occupation rather than conducting a hit-and-run raid. This suggested a more complex strategic objective that went beyond simple destruction or psychological impact. "Rebecca, this isn't a terrorist attack or a conventional assault," Sarah explained as she studied the pattern of hostile actions. "This is a demonstration. Someone is proving that they can penetrate, occupy, and control a major military installation, despite our best defensive efforts. The question is what they plan to do with that demonstration." Colonel Matthews arrived at the command post at 0547 hours, his earlier skepticism about Sarah's warnings replaced by desperate recognition that her expertise might be the key to resolving a crisis that conventional military thinking had failed to address. His acknowledgement of her analytical capabilities was implicit but clear. He needed her help regardless of his previous doubts about her credibility. "Colonel Chen, I understand you predicted something like this might happen," Matthews said, his tone mixing professional respect with personal frustration. "Right now, I need to know what these people want and how we can stop them without losing more personnel or critical infrastructure." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah's analysis of the tactical situation revealed a sophisticated adversary that had achieved strategic surprise through meticulous preparation and exploitation of institutional blind spots. The attackers had demonstrated capabilities that suggested significant resources and professional military training. Most importantly, their actions indicated strategic objectives that went beyond simple destruction to include psychological and political dimensions. The base's conventional response had been neutralized by adversaries who understood American military doctrine better than most American military personnel. Sarah realized that defeating this threat would require abandoning established procedures in favor of adaptive tactics that could match the attacker's flexibility and sophistication. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same institutional thinking that had dismissed her warnings was now preventing an effective response to the crisis she had predicted. As she prepared to brief Colonel Matthews on her tactical assessment, Sarah understood that the next few hours would determine not only the outcome of the current crisis, but also the future credibility of military institutions that had proven vulnerable to threats they refused to acknowledge. Her warnings had been dismissed, but now her expertise might be the only thing standing between the attackers and complete success in their demonstration of American military vulnerability. Sarah stared at the tactical display showing hostile positions throughout Camp Lejeune and made a decision that would either save lives or destroy what remained of her military reputation. The conventional response had failed catastrophically, with Marine units pinned down by adversaries who seemed to anticipate every standard tactical maneuver. Colonel Matthews stood beside her, his earlier confidence replaced by the grim recognition that his command was facing defeat by a force 1/10 their size. "Colonel Matthews, I need operational command of all available personnel for the next 2 hours, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority that had once directed complex operations in Afghanistan. "The current approach isn't working, because you're fighting an enemy who knows your doctrine better than you do. We need to abandon everything you've been taught about base defense." Matthews hesitated, clearly struggling with the unprecedented nature of authorizing a retired officer to command active-duty Marines during a live combat situation. His training and 30 years of experience argued against such an irregular arrangement, but the smoking ruins of his defensive positions provided compelling evidence that conventional thinking had become a liability. "What exactly are you proposing, Colonel Chen?" Matthews asked, his tone suggesting he was prepared to consider options that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Sarah pointed to the tactical display, highlighting the pattern of hostile positions and the failed Marine response attempts. "Your people are reacting to attacks instead of dictating the tempo of engagement. The enemy achieved surprise by exploiting your predictable defensive procedures. We need to become unpredictable ourselves, using tactics they haven't studied and can't anticipate." The proposal she outlined was radical by conventional military standards. Instead of organized unit movements following established doctrine, she wanted to deploy small teams using irregular tactics that combined elements of guerrilla warfare with precision strikes. Marines would operate independently, communicating through improvised signals rather than standard radio procedures that the enemy had clearly compromised. Major Torres, who had been monitoring communications from various Marine units, provided a situation update that emphasized the urgency of Sarah's proposal. "Sarah, we've lost contact with 3 squads that attempted standard flanking maneuvers. The enemy seems to know exactly where our people are going and what they're planning to do." Sarah's tactical assessment had identified the core problem. The attacking force had prepared for this specific engagement by studying American military doctrine and Marine Corps procedures. They could counter conventional tactics because they understood the institutional thinking that generated those tactics. Victory would require Marines to fight in ways that violated their training but matched the irregular nature of the threat they faced. Colonel Matthews, I need you to authorize immediate implementation of what I'm calling Operation Mirror Strike, Sarah continued, referencing the tactical plan she had been developing while monitoring the failed conventional response. Every Marine on this base will receive new orders that contradict their standard training. They'll operate in ways that feel wrong, but will be effective against an enemy who expects them to follow doctrine. The plan she presented was comprehensive and unconventional. Marine sniper teams would abandon elevated positions to engage from ground level using short-range tactics. Infantry squads would split into individual operators who moved independently rather than maintaining unit cohesion. Communication would rely on visual signals and predetermined timing rather than radio coordination that could be intercepted or jammed. Matthews reviewed the tactical proposal with the desperate attention of someone who recognized that conventional wisdom had become a death trap. Colonel Chen, what you're describing violates fundamental principles of military organization and tactics. If this fails, we could lose everything. Colonel, we're already losing everything, Sarah replied, gesturing toward the reports of Marine casualties and territorial losses that continued streaming into the command post. The enemy succeeded because they understood our principles better than we understood their capabilities. Mirror Strike gives us the element of surprise by abandoning the predictability that made us vulnerable. The authorization came at 0634 hours, with Colonel Matthews formally delegating tactical command to Sarah while retaining overall responsibility for the operation. The decision was unprecedented and would likely generate investigations and controversy regardless of the outcome, but the immediate crisis had created conditions where irregular solutions became necessary for survival. Sarah's first order violated every principle of military communication security. She directed all Marine units to abandon encrypted radio channels in favor of commercial cellular phones that the enemy wouldn't be monitoring. The tactical coordination would rely on a network of civilian devices that couldn't be jammed using military-grade electronic warfare equipment. The second directive was equally radical. Marine units would receive mission assignments through social media messages and text communications that appeared to be routine personal correspondence. Squad leaders would coordinate their movements through dating app messages and restaurant review posts that contained coded tactical information. The system was improvised and unconventional, but it provided communication security that the enemy hadn't prepared to counter. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, received her Mirror Strike assignment through what appeared to be a Facebook message from her sister discussing weekend dinner plans. The coded language directed her 8-person squad to abandon their defensive position and conduct a reconnaissance mission that would have been impossible using standard procedures. "Ma'am, with respect, this doesn't make any tactical sense," Gonzalez reported through the new communication system, her message disguised as a restaurant recommendation. "You're asking us to operate in ways that violate everything we've been trained to do." Sarah's response came through what appeared to be a reply about menu preferences. "Sergeant, the enemy studied our training and prepared counters for everything we've been taught to do. Mirror Strike works because it does things that don't make sense according to doctrine, but will be effective against an adversary who expects us to be predictable." The implementation of Mirror Strike created chaos that initially appeared to make the tactical situation worse. Marine units abandoned their positions and began moving in patterns that seemed random and disorganized. Communication became fragmented and difficult to monitor. The careful coordination that characterized professional military operations gave way to what appeared to be improvised individual actions. But Sarah's tactical assessment had anticipated this transitional confusion. The enemy had achieved their initial success by exploiting the predictable nature of military organization and doctrine. Mirror Strike succeeded by creating tactical conditions that the enemy couldn't predict or counter using their prepared responses. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, commanding the base's primary infantry battalion, found himself coordinating operations through Instagram direct messages while his Marines executed maneuvers that contradicted 20 years of tactical training. The psychological adjustment was as challenging as the physical execution of unfamiliar procedures. "This feels like we're abandoning everything that makes us effective as a military force," Harrison reported through a coded message that appeared to discuss his daughter's soccer practice schedule. Sarah's response came through what looked like advice about youth sports equipment. "Colonel, effectiveness is measured by results, not adherence to familiar procedures. The enemy prepared for Marines who fight like Marines. Mirror Strike gives you the advantage of fighting like something they've never encountered." The first successful engagement came at 0653 hours, when Corporal David Kim's fire team used mirror strike tactics to neutralize a hostile position that had pinned down 2 Marine squads for over an hour. Instead of the coordinated assault that doctrine prescribed, Kim's Marines attacked individually from unexpected directions using timing based on civilian social media posts rather than military communication protocols. The success created a tactical momentum that began shifting the overall engagement in favor of the defenders. Marine units throughout the base started reporting successful actions against enemies who appeared confused by tactics that didn't match American military doctrine. The irregular nature of mirror strike had created exactly the unpredictability that Sarah's analysis had identified as necessary for victory. As reports of successful engagements continued arriving through the improvised communication network, Colonel Matthews began to understand the strategic thinking behind Sarah's unconventional approach. The enemy's preparation had become their vulnerability when faced with tactics that existed outside their analytical framework. But Sarah knew that mirror strike's effectiveness would be temporary. The enemy would eventually adapt to the new tactical conditions, requiring another evolution in approach. The next phase of the engagement would determine whether her unauthorized command decisions had saved Camp Lejeune or simply delayed its inevitable fall to a superior adversary. The critical moment came at 0742 hours, when Sarah realized that mirror strike's initial success had created a new and more dangerous tactical situation. The attacking force, having recovered from their surprise at facing unconventional tactics, was adapting with a speed and sophistication that confirmed her worst fears about their capabilities. Through intercepted communications, she learned that the enemy commander was reorganizing his forces to counter the irregular Marine tactics, demonstrating a level of tactical flexibility that matched her own. Sarah stood in the makeshift command center that had been established in an abandoned maintenance building, surrounded by Marines who were beginning to understand that their survival depended on following orders from someone who wasn't technically their commander. The improvised communication network buzzed with reports from units across the base, painted a picture of an engagement that was evolving faster than either side's ability to maintain strategic control. Colonel Chen, the enemy is consolidating positions around the ammunition depot and the communications center, reported Sergeant Major Patricia Williams through a coded text message that appeared to discuss her granddaughter's birthday party. They seemed to be shifting from offensive operations to establishing permanent control over critical infrastructure. The intelligence confirmed Sarah's analysis that this wasn't a typical terrorist attack designed to cause maximum casualties and psychological impact. The enemy's objectives were strategic, aimed at demonstrating their ability to seize and hold key military assets despite the presence of a substantial defensive force. The implications extended far beyond Camp Lejeune to the broader question of American military vulnerability to asymmetric threats. Sarah's tactical assessment revealed that the enemy had entered the most dangerous phase of their operation. Having achieved their initial objectives through surprise and superior preparation, they were now attempting to consolidate gains that would allow them to dictate the terms of any negotiated resolution. Their control of critical infrastructure gave them leverage that could be used for political or strategic purposes that went beyond the immediate military situation. "All units, this is Mirror Command," Sarah transmitted through the network of civilian devices that had become her primary means of tactical coordination. The enemy is transitioning to defensive operations designed to hold territory rather than inflict casualties. This creates opportunities for us to regain initiative, but it also means they're prepared for a prolonged engagement. The response from Marine units throughout the base reflected the strange new dynamic that had emerged during the crisis. Sarah's unauthorized command had proven effective enough that Marines were following her orders despite the irregular nature of the command structure. Their trust had been earned through tactical success rather than institutional authority, creating a leadership relationship that existed outside normal military hierarchy. Captain Jennifer Walsh, commanding a composite unit of Marines from 3 different companies, found herself coordinating with enemy forces that demonstrated tactical discipline equal to her own. The engagement had evolved beyond the initial chaos of surprise attack into something resembling conventional military operations, but conducted under conditions that made traditional command and control impossible. "Mirror Command, this is Composite Alpha," Walsh reported through a social media post that appeared to discuss weekend hiking plans. "Enemy positions are well established and professionally fortified. They're not behaving like terrorists or insurgents. These people have military training equivalent to our own. Sarah's analysis of enemy capabilities had reached the same conclusion. The attacking force consisted of individuals with professional military backgrounds, who had been extensively trained for this specific mission. Their knowledge of American tactics and doctrine suggested either foreign military personnel or former American service members who had been recruited for this operation. Either possibility carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The realization that she was facing professionally trained military opponents forced Sarah to reconsider her entire approach to the engagement. Mirror strike had succeeded against enemies who expected conventional marine tactics, but it might prove inadequate against adversaries who could adapt as quickly as she could innovate. The next phase would require tactical evolution that stayed ahead of an enemy who was learning from each engagement. "Colonel Matthews, I need immediate access to every unconventional warfare specialist on this base," Sarah requested through an encrypted message system that used commercial gaming platforms to mask military communications. "We're not fighting terrorists anymore. We're fighting soldiers who are as good as we are, which means we need to become better than we've ever been." The resources that Matthews provided access to included Marines with backgrounds in special operations, intelligence, and unconventional warfare techniques that weren't part of standard infantry training. These specialists had experience operating outside normal military doctrine, making them ideal for the type of tactical innovation that the current situation demanded. Staff Sergeant Carlos Ramirez, a former reconnaissance Marine with extensive experience in irregular warfare, joined Sarah's improvised command structure at 0758 hours. His assessment of the tactical situation confirmed the evolution she had observed in enemy capabilities and tactics. "Ma'am, these aren't the same people who conducted the initial assault," Ramirez reported through a coded message disguised as a restaurant review. "The individuals we're engaging now are operating with tactical sophistication that suggests advanced military training and extensive preparation for this specific engagement." Sarah realized that the enemy had committed their most capable personnel to the consolidation phase of the operation, recognizing that maintaining control of seized territory would be more challenging than achieving initial tactical surprise. The shift in enemy capabilities required a corresponding evolution in her own tactical approach, moving beyond mirror strike to something even more unconventional and unpredictable. The solution she developed was radical even by the standards of the morning's irregular operations. Instead of attempting to counter the enemy's defensive positions through direct assault, she would use the base's own infrastructure against them. Marines would exploit their detailed knowledge of Camp Lejeune's layout, utility systems, and support facilities to conduct operations that no external enemy could anticipate or counter. "All units prepare for Phase 2 operations," Sarah transmitted through the network that had become increasingly sophisticated as Marines adapted to unconventional communication methods. "We're going to use home field advantage in ways that textbooks don't teach and enemies can't study." The tactical concept she outlined involved using the base's underground utility tunnels, maintenance access points, and service corridors to move personnel and equipment without exposing them to enemy observation or fire. Marines would emerge from positions that appeared to be solid walls or floor surfaces, conducting operations that seemed to violate the physical laws governing military tactics. Corporal Sarah Chen, a combat engineer with detailed knowledge of the base's infrastructure, became a key figure in implementing the new tactical approach. Her understanding of structural vulnerabilities and hidden access points provided opportunities that traditional military thinking wouldn't have recognized or exploited. "Mirror Command, this is Engineer 1, Chen reported through a fitness app that disguised tactical communications as workout progress updates. "The base infrastructure provides multiple concealed routes that could support operations the enemy won't expect. We can appear anywhere without being detected during movement." The implementation of Phase 2 operations required Marines to abandon not just conventional tactics but conventional thinking about what was physically possible during military engagements. They moved through spaces that weren't designed for human occupation, used equipment in ways that violated safety protocols, and coordinated actions through systems that existed outside normal military infrastructure. The psychological impact on enemy forces was immediate and devastating. Professional soldiers, who had prepared for every conventional response, found themselves facing attacks that seemed to emerge from impossible locations using methods that defied tactical logic. The Marines' intimate knowledge of their own base had become a weapon that no amount of external intelligence gathering could counter. But Sarah understood that even the most innovative tactics would eventually be countered by a sufficiently capable adversary. The enemy's demonstrated ability to adapt meant that Phase 2 operations would provide only temporary advantage. The final resolution of the crisis would require something beyond tactical innovation, something that challenged the enemy's fundamental assumptions about their strategic objectives and the nature of the engagement they had initiated. As reports of successful Phase 2 operations continued arriving through increasingly creative communication channels, Sarah began planning for what she hoped would be the decisive phase of an engagement that had already exceeded everyone's expectations for both its complexity and its stakes. The turning point came at 0847 hours when Sarah received intelligence that changed her understanding of the entire operation. Through intercepted enemy communications, she learned that the attacking force was preparing to execute what they called final demonstration, a coordinated action designed to prove their complete control over Camp Lejeune before withdrawing with their strategic objectives accomplished. The revelation that this was intended as a temporary occupation rather than a permanent seizure created new tactical possibilities that she immediately began to exploit. Sarah gathered her improvised command staff in the maintenance building that had become the nerve center for the base's defense. The Marines surrounding her represented every specialty and rank structure, united by shared recognition that conventional military hierarchy had proven inadequate for the crisis they faced. Their willingness to follow her unauthorized leadership had evolved from desperate necessity into genuine respect for tactical expertise that had kept them alive through an impossible situation. The enemy's plan requires them to maintain control of key positions for another 90 minutes while they document their success for strategic purposes, Sarah explained, reviewing the intelligence that painted a picture of adversaries more concerned with political impact than military victory. They're not trying to permanently occupy this base. They're trying to create a demonstration that will undermine confidence in American military security. The intelligence revealed the sophisticated nature of the enemy's strategic thinking. Their assault on Camp Lejeune was designed to generate political and psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. By proving that a small, well-trained force could penetrate, occupy, and control a major American military installation, they hoped to create doubts about military effectiveness that would influence policy decisions and public opinion. Major Torres, who had adapted to the irregular command structure with remarkable flexibility, raised the question that dominated everyone's thinking. "Sarah, if they're planning to withdraw anyway, do we risk additional casualties trying to force them out early, or do we focus on minimizing damage until they complete their demonstration?" The question reflected the complex calculus that had replaced simple tactical thinking during the extended engagement. Sarah's analysis suggested that the enemy's withdrawal would be as carefully planned and professionally executed as their initial assault. Attempting to disrupt their timeline might provoke escalation that could result in casualties that were otherwise avoidable. But Sarah also understood the broader implications of allowing the enemy to complete their demonstration according to their preferred schedule. The political and strategic damage from a successful occupation, even a temporary one, could undermine military credibility and influence security policies in ways that affected national defense far beyond Camp Lejeune. "We're going to deny them their demonstration," Sarah decided, her voice carrying the authority that had emerged from hours of successful tactical innovation. "Not by preventing their withdrawal, but by ensuring that when they leave, the story is about American tactical adaptation rather than enemy success." The plan she outlined was designed to transform the narrative of the engagement from enemy demonstration of American vulnerability into American demonstration of tactical flexibility and leadership effectiveness. Instead of simply surviving the assault, the Marines would document their own adaptation and innovation in ways that emphasized their ability to overcome superior preparation and initial surprise. Sergeant Major Williams, whose experience included multiple deployments and extensive training in psychological operations, immediately understood the strategic thinking behind Sarah's approach. "Ma'am, you're talking about winning the information war while we're still fighting the tactical engagement." Sarah nodded, recognizing that Williams had grasped the multidimensional nature of modern military operations. "The enemy succeeded tactically by exploiting our institutional predictability. We're going to succeed strategically by demonstrating institutional adaptability that turns their temporary victory into long-term validation of American military effectiveness." The implementation required Marines throughout the base to document their tactical adaptations, irregular communication methods, and innovative approaches to problems that conventional training hadn't prepared them to solve. Instead of simply following orders, they became active participants in creating a record of military evolution under pressure. Corporal Kim, whose fire team had achieved the first successful mirror strike engagement, found himself explaining tactical innovations to video cameras operated by Marines with public affairs backgrounds. The documentation process captured not just successful actions, but the thinking process that had generated those actions under conditions of extreme stress and institutional uncertainty. The key thing is that we stopped trying to fight the way we were taught and started fighting the way the situation required, Kim explained, his words recorded for analysis by military professionals who would study the engagement for years to come. Colonel Chen showed us that effectiveness matters more than doctrine when you're facing enemies who understand your doctrine better than you do. Similar documentation was occurring throughout the base as Marines recorded their experiences with unconventional tactics, irregular communication methods, and leadership structures that existed outside normal military hierarchy. The collective record provided evidence of institutional adaptability that countered the enemy's narrative of American military rigidity and predictability. At 0923 hours, the enemy began their carefully planned withdrawal, executing movement patterns that demonstrated the same professional competence that had characterized their entire operation. Their departure was orderly and disciplined, designed to minimize casualties while maximizing the psychological impact of their successful demonstration. But they withdrew from a base that had transformed during their occupation. The Marines they left behind were no longer the conventional force that had been surprised by the initial assault. They had become something new, a military organization that had proven capable of tactical innovation and leadership adaptation under the most challenging possible circumstances. Colonel Matthews, whose authorization of Sarah's irregular command had violated numerous regulations and policies, found himself facing the complex task of explaining the morning's events to superior officers who would struggle to understand how a retired Army officer had successfully commanded active-duty Marines during a live combat engagement. Colonel Chen, I'm going to face questions about this operation that I'm not sure how to answer, Matthews admitted as they surveyed the base that was slowly returning to normal operations. What you accomplished this morning doesn't fit any existing framework for military command and control. Sarah understood the institutional challenges that Matthews would face, but she also understood that the morning's events had demonstrated possibilities that extended beyond traditional military thinking. Colonel, the enemy succeeded initially because they understood our institutional limitations better than we did. This morning proved that those limitations aren't permanent when leadership is willing to adapt. The after-action reviews and investigations that would follow would focus on the irregular nature of Sarah's command authority and the unprecedented tactics that had proven effective against a sophisticated adversary. But the Marines who had survived the engagement understood something that formal reviews might not capture. They had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed by following leadership that challenged their assumptions about what was possible. As emergency personnel worked to assess damage and restore normal base operations, Sarah prepared for the inevitable scrutiny that would accompany her unauthorized assumption of tactical command. Her actions had been successful, but success didn't necessarily provide protection against institutional criticism of methods that violated established procedures. The radio chatter that had characterized the crisis was giving way to formal reports and official communications as Camp Lejeune transitioned from combat operations back to administrative routine. But the Marines involved in the morning's engagement continued using the improvised communication networks they had developed, maintaining connections that transcended normal unit boundaries and rank structures. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez, whose squad had executed multiple successful mirror strike operations, captured the transformation that had occurred when she reported to her company commander. "Sir, we learned this morning that we're capable of more than our training taught us to believe. Colonel Chen showed us that leadership isn't about following procedures. It's about achieving objectives despite obstacles that procedures can't anticipate." The statement reflected a change in thinking that extended beyond tactical techniques to fundamental questions about military effectiveness and leadership development. The Marines had discovered that their greatest asset wasn't their equipment or training, but their ability to adapt when conventional approaches proved inadequate. As Sarah prepared to leave Camp Lejeune for what might be the final time, she understood that the morning's events had changed not just her own career trajectory, but the broader conversation about military leadership and institutional flexibility. The base was secure, The enemy had been denied their preferred narrative, and a new generation of Marines had learned that effectiveness could emerge from the most unlikely sources when circumstances demanded innovation over adherence to established doctrine. The Pentagon briefing room buzzed with tension 3 weeks after the Camp Lejeune incident, as Sarah Chen sat at a witness table facing a panel of generals whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. The formal investigation into her unauthorized assumption of command had attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership, creating a spectacle that would determine not just her personal fate, but the broader question of how the military would respond to tactical innovations that violated established doctrine. General Patricia Morrison, the Marine Corps Commandant, led the inquiry with the measured tone of someone who understood that the proceedings would influence military policy for decades. Colonel Chen, you assumed tactical command of active duty personnel during a live combat situation without proper authorization, using methods that contradicted established military doctrine. How do you justify actions that violated fundamental principles of military organization? Sarah had prepared for this moment during weeks of legal consultations and strategic planning, but she also understood that her defense would need to address institutional concerns that extended beyond technical violations of command authority. General Morrison, I responded to a tactical situation where conventional approaches had failed and Marines were dying. My actions were guided by the principle that mission accomplishment and troop welfare take precedence over procedural compliance. The response triggered immediate discussion among the panel members, whose backgrounds included combat veterans who understood the tension between institutional requirements and battlefield realities. But Sarah could see that her defense would need to address not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader implications of her methods for military discipline and command structure. This summit, Colonel James Bradley, serving as the inquiry's legal advisor, pressed the institutional concerns that dominated the proceedings. Colonel Chen, military effectiveness depends on clear command structures and predictable procedures. Your actions created precedents that could undermine discipline throughout the armed forces if soldiers begin deciding for themselves which orders to follow and which to ignore. Sarah recognized the fundamental challenge she faced, proving that tactical innovation could coexist with military discipline without creating institutional chaos. Colonel Bradley, the enemy succeeded initially by exploiting our institutional predictability. Military effectiveness requires the ability to adapt when conventional approaches prove inadequate, but that adaptation must be guided by professional judgment and tactical expertise rather than personal preference or convenience. The distinction she drew between principled tactical adaptation and arbitrary rule-breaking reflected months of analysis about how the military could maintain institutional coherence while developing the flexibility necessary to counter evolving threats. Her argument required demonstrating that unconventional leadership could strengthen rather than weaken military effectiveness. Major Rebecca Torres testified about the tactical situation that had led to Sarah's unauthorized assumption of command, providing context that emphasized the desperate circumstances that had made irregular solutions necessary. The conventional response had failed completely. Marines were pinned down by enemies who seemed to anticipate every standard tactical maneuver. Colonel Chen's intervention saved lives and prevented the loss of critical military infrastructure. Torres's testimony was supported by detailed after-action reports from Marines who had participated in the mirror strike operations and subsequent tactical innovations. Their accounts consistently emphasized that Sarah's unconventional methods had been more effective than traditional approaches, but they also raised questions about whether such methods could be integrated into standard military training and doctrine. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, whose squad had executed multiple successful operations under Sarah's command, provided testimony that captured the perspective of enlisted personnel who had experienced the tactical innovations firsthand. Ma'am, Colonel Chen didn't just give us different orders, she taught us to think differently about what was possible. We learned that our training was a foundation, not a limitation, and that real leadership means helping people exceed what they thought they could accomplish. The testimony revealed the transformational impact that the Camp Lejeune engagement had produced among participating Marines, but it also highlighted concerns about how such experiences might affect military discipline and institutional cohesion. Several panel members expressed worry that encouraging tactical innovation might lead to widespread disregard for established procedures and command authority. General Robert Hayes, whose extensive combat experience included command of Special Operations Forces, offered a perspective that bridged tactical innovation and institutional requirements. The enemy's success came from studying our doctrine and preparing counters for our predictable responses. Colonel Chen's effectiveness came from operating outside that predictable framework while maintaining professional standards and tactical discipline. Hayes's analysis suggested that the solution wasn't choosing between innovation and discipline, but developing institutional frameworks that could accommodate both requirements. His questions focused on how the military could prepare leaders to make the kind of tactical adaptations that Sarah had demonstrated, while maintaining the organizational coherence that conventional doctrine provided. The proceedings took an unexpected turn when classified intelligence was presented regarding the attacking force's composition and objectives. Sarah learned for the first time that the enemy had included former American military personnel who had been recruited by foreign intelligence services specifically for their knowledge of American tactics and procedures. This revelation reframed the entire engagement, transforming it from an isolated security incident into evidence of a broader strategic threat that required institutional adaptation rather than individual innovation. The enemy's use of American tactical knowledge against American forces suggested vulnerabilities that could be exploited repeatedly unless the military developed more flexible approaches to doctrine and training. General Morrison's final questions addressed the institutional implications that would determine how the military integrated lessons learned from the Camp Lejeune engagement. Colonel Chen, assuming your tactical innovations prove worthy of broader implementation, how do we maintain military discipline while encouraging the kind of adaptive thinking that proved effective during your unauthorized command? Sarah's response reflected months of analysis about military leadership and institutional development. General Morrison, effective military organizations must balance adherence to proven principles with adaptation to evolving threats. The key is ensuring that tactical innovation is guided by professional expertise and institutional values rather than personal preference or expedient solutions to immediate problems. The hearing concluded with Sarah's formal recommendation that the military establish training programs focused on adaptive leadership and tactical innovation, designed to prepare officers for situations where conventional doctrine proved inadequate. Her proposal emphasized that such training should strengthen, rather than weaken institutional discipline, by providing frameworks for principled adaptation under extreme circumstances. 3 days later, Sarah received notification that the inquiry had concluded with a formal reprimand for violation of command authority, accompanied by a recommendation that she be recruited to develop the adaptive leadership training program she had proposed. The decision reflected institutional recognition that her methods, while irregular, had demonstrated capabilities that the military needed to understand and integrate into its broader strategic approach. The Marines who had served under her unauthorized command received commendations for tactical innovation and adaptive thinking, recognition that validated their willingness to follow unconventional leadership during a crisis that conventional approaches had failed to resolve. Their experiences became case studies in military education programs designed to prepare future leaders for the kind of adaptive challenges that traditional training had not anticipated. Sarah's transformation from dismissed guest speaker to acknowledged tactical innovator reflected broader changes in military thinking about leadership, doctrine, and institutional adaptation. The Camp Lejeune engagement had demonstrated that effectiveness sometimes required abandoning familiar approaches in favor of solutions that challenged institutional assumptions about what was possible under extreme circumstances. 2 years after the Camp Lejeune incident, Sarah Chen stood before a classroom of Marine officers at the newly established Center for Adaptive Military Leadership in Quantico, Virginia. The facility represented the military's institutional commitment to developing the kind of tactical flexibility that her unauthorized command had demonstrated during the crisis. Her transformation from dismissed guest speaker to director of revolutionary military training programs had become a symbol of the armed forces' evolving approach to leadership development and strategic thinking. The officers facing her represented the military's most promising leaders, selected for advanced training in adaptive tactics and unconventional problem-solving. Their backgrounds included combat veterans, staff officers, and specialists, whose conventional military education had prepared them for predictable challenges but left them vulnerable to the kind of sophisticated threats that modern adversaries employed with increasing frequency. 2 years ago, I was standing in a briefing hall 12 miles from here, watching Marines dismiss warnings about threats they couldn't recognize, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that had emerged from proven success under impossible circumstances. Today you're here because the military has acknowledged that our greatest vulnerability isn't inadequate equipment or insufficient training. It's institutional thinking that makes us predictable to enemies who study our doctrine more carefully than we question our assumptions. The curriculum she had developed challenged fundamental premises about military leadership and tactical decision-making. Students learned to operate outside established doctrine while maintaining professional standards and institutional values. They practiced communication methods that couldn't be intercepted or jammed by conventional electronic warfare. Most importantly, they developed the psychological flexibility necessary to abandon familiar approaches when circumstances demanded innovation over adherence to proven procedures. Captain Michael Torres, Rebecca's younger brother and one of Sarah's most dedicated students, raised the question that dominated discussions about adaptive leadership. "Ma'am, how do we balance institutional discipline with the kind of tactical innovation that proved effective at Camp Lejeune? How do we maintain military cohesion while encouraging officers to think outside established frameworks?" Sarah's response reflected 2 years of analysis about military effectiveness and institutional development. Captain Torres: "Discipline and innovation aren't opposing forces. They're complementary capabilities that strengthen each other when properly integrated. Effective military organizations maintain discipline through shared professional values and common strategic objectives, not through rigid adherence to tactical procedures that enemies can study and counter." The training program she directed had already influenced military operations worldwide, with graduates applying adaptive leadership principles in conflicts that ranged from counterterrorism missions to humanitarian crises. Their success validated Sarah's argument that tactical flexibility strengthened rather than weakened military effectiveness when guided by professional expertise and institutional values. Colonel David Matthews, now commanding general of the Marine Corps Training and Education Command, had become one of Sarah's strongest advocates within the military hierarchy. His willingness to authorize her irregular command during the Camp Lejeune crisis had initially threatened his career, but ultimately led to promotion and recognition as a visionary leader who understood the evolving nature of military challenges. "Sarah's work has fundamentally changed how we think about military leadership," Matthews explained during a Pentagon briefing on adaptive tactics training. "We've learned that our strength isn't our ability to follow predetermined procedures, but our capacity to achieve objectives despite obstacles that those procedures can't anticipate." The transformation extended beyond individual training programs to influence military doctrine and strategic planning at the highest levels. Sarah's analysis of institutional vulnerabilities had contributed to comprehensive reviews of security procedures, communication protocols, and command structures that had proven inadequate against sophisticated adversaries who understood American military thinking better than many American military leaders. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, now a senior instructor at the Adaptive Leadership Center, had become living proof of the program's effectiveness. Her experience during the Camp Lejeune engagement had transformed her from a conventional Marine non-commissioned officer into an expert in tactical innovation and adaptive problem-solving whose insights influenced training programs throughout the armed forces. "Colonel Chen taught us that our training was a foundation for thinking, not a substitute for it," Gonzalez explained to new students who struggled with concepts that challenged their conventional military education. "The enemy succeeded by exploiting our predictability. We succeeded by becoming unpredictable while maintaining our professional standards and tactical discipline." The impact of Sarah's work extended beyond military applications to influence law enforcement, emergency management, and corporate security programs that faced similar challenges from adversaries who studied conventional responses and prepared sophisticated counters. Her principles of adaptive leadership had proven applicable to any organization that needed to maintain effectiveness against evolving threats. The recognition came in various forms, from professional awards to speaking invitations at international conferences on military innovation and strategic adaptation. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from reports of successful operations by graduates who had applied adaptive leadership principles in real-world situations where conventional approaches had proven inadequate. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Walsh, whose composite unit had fought effectively during the Camp Lejeune engagement, commanded a special operations task force that had successfully countered terrorist networks using tactics derived from Sarah's training programs. Her unit's effectiveness validated the broader applicability of adaptive leadership principles beyond the specific circumstances that had originally demonstrated their value. "The key insight is that enemies study our doctrine and prepare counters for our predictable responses," Walsh reported during a classified briefing on counterterrorism operations. "Adaptive leadership gives us the ability to operate outside their analytical framework, while maintaining the professional standards that make us effective as military personnel. Sarah's influence had also generated criticism from military traditionalists, who argued that encouraging tactical innovation might undermine institutional discipline and create dangerous precedents for unauthorized decision-making. These concerns were addressed through careful program design that emphasized professional judgment and adherence to strategic objectives, while allowing flexibility in tactical methods. The debate reflected broader questions about military effectiveness in an era when adversaries possessed sophisticated understanding of American capabilities and procedures. Sarah's work represented one approach to addressing these challenges, but it also highlighted the need for continued evolution in military thinking and institutional adaptation. During her evening walks around the Quantico base, Sarah often reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a dismissed guest speaker into one of the military's most influential theorists on adaptive leadership and tactical innovation. The transformation had required abandoning conventional career paths in favor of pursuing insights that challenged institutional assumptions about effectiveness and leadership. The Marines she encountered during these walks represented the future of military leadership, individuals who had been trained to think adaptively while maintaining the professional values that defined military service. Their confidence reflected not arrogance but competence, the knowledge that they possessed capabilities that extended beyond conventional training to include the intellectual flexibility necessary to counter evolving threats. As Sarah prepared for the next day's classes, she understood that her work had contributed to a fundamental shift in military thinking about leadership, effectiveness, and institutional adaptation. The dismissed warnings that had begun her involvement with Camp Lejeune had evolved into accepted doctrine that influenced military operations worldwide. The transformation validated her belief that effectiveness sometimes required challenging institutional assumptions and pursuing solutions that existed outside conventional frameworks. Her unauthorized command had demonstrated that military leadership could be both innovative and disciplined, adaptive and professional, unconventional and effective. Most importantly, her work had proven that size, status, and institutional position mattered less than expertise, determination, and the courage to act when circumstances demanded solutions that conventional thinking couldn't provide. 5 years after Camp Lejeune, Sarah Chen received an urgent call that would test everything she had learned about adaptive leadership and institutional change. The voice on the secure line belonged to General Patricia Morrison, now Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, calling from a crisis situation room in the Pentagon, where senior military leaders were grappling with a threat that conventional doctrine couldn't address. "Sarah, we're facing a coordinated assault on 3 major installations simultaneously," Morrison explained, her voice carrying the strain of someone managing a crisis that exceeded all previous planning scenarios. "The attackers are using variations of the tactics you encountered at Lejeune, but they've evolved their methods based on our institutional responses to your recommendations. We need your immediate assistance." The intelligence briefing that followed revealed the sophisticated nature of the threat. Enemy forces had studied not just traditional American military doctrine, but also the adaptive leadership principles that Sarah's programs had introduced throughout the armed forces. They had prepared counters for both conventional responses and the tactical innovations that had proven effective during the Camp Lejeune engagement, creating a strategic challenge that required evolution beyond existing frameworks. Within hours, Sarah found herself aboard a military transport aircraft heading toward Fort Bragg, where she would coordinate a joint response involving personnel from all service branches. The aircraft also carried a team of adaptive leadership specialists, former students whose expertise represented the institutionalization of principles that had once been considered radical departures from military tradition. Colonel Michael Torres, now commanding the military's first official adaptive response unit, briefed Sarah on the tactical situation during the flight. "Ma'am, the enemy has essentially created counters for our counters. They're exploiting the predictability that emerged when adaptive tactics became part of standard doctrine. We need to evolve again, but this time we're starting from a position where our innovations have become familiar to sophisticated adversaries." The challenge represented the natural evolution of tactical competition between adversaries who studied each other's methods and developed increasingly sophisticated responses. Sarah's original innovations had been effective because they operated outside enemy expectations, but success had led to institutionalization that created new forms of predictability for enemies to exploit. The Joint Operations Center at Fort Bragg buzzed with activity as military personnel from different services worked to coordinate responses to simultaneous attacks that stretched resources and challenged command structures designed for single-threat scenarios. Sarah observed the familiar signs of institutional stress when established procedures proved inadequate for evolving challenges. Lieutenant General James Bradley, the Joint Operations Commander, greeted Sarah with the mixture of respect and desperation that characterized military leaders facing threats that exceeded their training and experience. "Colonel Chen, we've implemented your adaptive leadership principles throughout our command structure, but the enemy seems to have prepared for exactly those innovations. They're countering our tactical flexibility with strategic adaptations that neutralize our advantages." Sarah's analysis of the intelligence reports revealed the enemy's sophisticated understanding of American military evolution since Camp Lejeune. They had studied not just her tactical innovations but the institutional processes that had integrated those innovations into standard military doctrine. Their current assault exploited the systematic nature of military adaptation, using the armed forces' own learning processes against them. General Bradley, the enemy's advantage comes from studying our institutional responses more carefully than we've studied our own assumptions, Sarah explained, as she reviewed tactical displays showing the scope of the coordinated assault. They understand that military organizations systematize successful innovations, which creates new forms of predictability that can be exploited by patient adversaries. The solution she proposed challenged the institutionalization of adaptive leadership itself. Instead of relying on standardized approaches to tactical innovation, military responses would need to become truly adaptive, changing not just tactics, but the fundamental processes by which tactical changes were developed and implemented. Major Jennifer Walsh, now commanding a multi-service special operations unit, had arrived from overseas deployment to participate in the coordinated response. Her experience applying adaptive leadership principles in various international conflicts provided perspective on how Sarah's methods had evolved through practical application in diverse operational environments. "Ma'am, we've been successful by applying your principles systematically, but systematic application has made us predictable again," Walsh reported during the initial planning session. "The enemy has learned to counter our adaptive methods by predicting the types of innovations we're likely to develop." Sarah recognized the fundamental challenge that faced any military organization attempting to maintain tactical advantage over time. Success led to institutionalization, which created predictability that sophisticated enemies could exploit. The solution required abandoning not just specific tactics but systematic approaches to tactical development. The response she designed involved creating multiple independent command structures that would develop tactical innovations without coordination or communication between them. Each structure would operate according to different principles and assumptions, ensuring that enemy preparation for one approach wouldn't compromise the effectiveness of alternatives. The implementation required military personnel to abandon the coordination and communication that had become fundamental to their understanding of effective operations. Units would operate independently, developing solutions to shared problems without knowledge of how other units were addressing similar challenges. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, now a master instructor in adaptive leadership, found herself commanding a composite unit that included personnel from all service branches who had never worked together and weren't allowed to communicate with parallel units facing identical challenges. The psychological adjustment was as difficult as the tactical execution of unfamiliar procedures. "This feels like we're abandoning everything we've learned about military effectiveness," Gonzalez reported through communication channels that were isolated from other operational units. "We're operating without the coordination and mutual support that military doctrine considers essential for success." Sarah's response emphasized the temporary nature of the approach and its specific applicability to adversaries who had learned to exploit military coordination and systematic thinking. Sergeant Gonzalez, effectiveness requires adapting to the specific nature of the threat we're facing. The enemy succeeds by predicting our coordination and systematic responses. Independent operations deny them the predictability they need to counter our actions. The results began emerging within hours as military units throughout the affected installations reported successful engagements against enemies who appeared confused by responses that didn't match any prepared counters. The lack of coordination between American units had created tactical conditions that enemy planning hadn't anticipated. But Sarah understood that even these latest innovations would eventually be studied and countered by sufficiently sophisticated adversaries. The fundamental challenge of maintaining tactical advantage required continuous evolution that stayed ahead of enemy adaptation, creating an ongoing competition that would define military effectiveness for the foreseeable future. As reports of successful operations continued arriving through isolated communication channels, Sarah began planning for the next phase of tactical evolution, recognizing that her role had become managing an ongoing process of adaptation rather than developing specific solutions to immediate problems. 10 years had transformed Sarah Chen from an overlooked guest speaker into the military's foremost authority on adaptive leadership, but the phone call that arrived on a quiet Sunday morning would test whether her decade of innovation could address a threat that transcended everything she had previously encountered. The Secretary of Defense was calling personally, a distinction reserved for crises that challenged national security at the highest levels. Colonel Chen, we're facing a situation that goes beyond tactical adaptation, Secretary Williams explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had exhausted conventional options. The enemy has evolved beyond studying our methods to actively recruiting our personnel, creating adversarial forces that include former American military leaders trained in your adaptive leadership principles. The intelligence briefing that followed revealed a chilling development in asymmetric warfare. Foreign powers had systematically recruited retired American military personnel, offering them substantial compensation to apply their expertise in developing tactics specifically designed to counter American adaptive leadership capabilities. The enemy now included individuals who had been trained by Sarah herself, creating an unprecedented strategic challenge. Within hours, Sarah found herself in a classified facility outside Washington, briefing a joint task force that included representatives from every major military and intelligence organization. The assembled leadership represented decades of combined experience, but their expressions conveyed the uncertainty of professionals facing a problem that existed outside their analytical frameworks. The fundamental issue is that our own people have become our most dangerous adversaries, Sarah explained, reviewing intelligence reports that documented the recruitment and deployment of former American military personnel by hostile foreign powers. They understand not just our doctrine and tactics, but our institutional thinking and adaptive processes. They can predict our innovations because they helped develop them. General Morrison, whose career had been shaped by the lessons learned from Camp Lejeune, posed the question that dominated strategic planning discussions. Sarah, if our own adaptive capabilities can be turned against us, how do we maintain effectiveness without creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited by people who understand our methods better than we do? The solution Sarah proposed challenged fundamental assumptions about military knowledge and institutional memory. Instead of building on previous innovations, the military would need to develop completely new approaches to leadership and tactics that couldn't be compromised by individuals with knowledge of existing methods. We need to create what I'm calling generational separation in our tactical development, Sarah explained to the task force. New approaches that are completely disconnected from previous methods, developed by personnel who haven't been exposed to existing adaptive leadership principles. The concept required identifying military personnel who had no previous exposure to Sarah's methods and training them according to completely different principles. These individuals would develop tactical innovations that couldn't be anticipated by adversaries familiar with adaptive leadership doctrine, creating capabilities that existed outside enemy analytical frameworks. The implementation began immediately, with the establishment of isolated training facilities, where selected personnel developed military capabilities according to principles that contradicted everything the armed forces had learned over the previous decade. The psychological challenge was immense, requiring abandonment of proven methods in favor of untested approaches developed by individuals with limited experience. But early results suggested that the concept was sound. Military units trained according to the new principles achieved tactical success against adversaries who possessed detailed knowledge of adaptive leadership methods but couldn't predict responses developed outside that framework. Sarah understood that her greatest contribution to military effectiveness might ultimately be recognizing when her own innovations had become liabilities and developing the institutional courage to abandon successful methods in favor of continued evolution. The enemy's recruitment of American military expertise had created a strategic challenge that required rethinking fundamental assumptions about knowledge, experience, and tactical advantage. As she prepared for the next phase of military evolution, Sarah reflected on the journey that had transformed her from dismissed outsider to recognized authority, to potential obstacle to continued effectiveness. The greatest test of adaptive leadership was recognizing when adaptation itself needed to be transcended in favor of approaches that existed beyond existing frameworks for innovation and institutional learning. Sarah stood on the same podium at Camp Lejeune where her journey had begun a decade earlier, but everything had changed. The Marines facing her weren't just listening politely to another guest speaker. They were hanging on every word from the woman who had revolutionized how America's military thinks about leadership, adaptation, and the courage to challenge institutional assumptions. 10 years ago, you would have dismissed me as too small to matter, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. Today, Marine units worldwide use principles that emerged from that dismissal. The greatest victories often come from the most unlikely sources. Behind her, a banner displayed the motto of the newly established Sarah Chen Institute for Adaptive Leadership: "Size doesn't determine strength, determination does." The inscription captured a truth that extended far beyond military applications to anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they weren't enough. Colonel Torres, now the base commander, concluded the ceremony with words that had become legendary throughout the armed forces. When everyone said it was impossible, Colonel Chen proved that impossible is just another word for nobody tried the right approach yet. As Sarah left the stage, she reflected on the remarkable journey from dismissed guest speaker to institutional revolutionary. Her unauthorized command during that chaotic morning had demonstrated that leadership isn't about position or permission. It's about expertise, courage, and the willingness to act when others hesitate. The Marines, who had once doubted her capabilities, now trained according to principles she had developed under fire. Her story had become proof that the most profound changes often begin with individuals who refuse to accept limitations that others consider permanent. Sarah's transformation reminded everyone that in a world full of challenges that conventional wisdom can't solve, the next breakthrough might come from someone everyone underestimated, including themselves.